questions.
Welcome everyone to Is Universality Worth Fighting For? My name is Michael Howard and I will be the moderator for this session. Before we start, I would like to give a brief overview of how to use Crowdcast. If you would like to submit a question to the speakers, please post in the Ask a Question section down below. You may also vote on questions already posted by other attendees. This will help us to determine which questions to prioritize. Next, there is a chat box, which I see many of you are already using on the side, and this is where you can hold side conversations and where we will post any links and supplemental information. In order to keep things moving, we may not get around to responding to any activity in the chat, so please be sure to submit any questions using the Ask a Question function. Now let me introduce the speakers. I will be making a short presentation. I'm Michael Howard. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Maine. I've been interested in basic income for about 2 decades. I'm the current coordinator of the U.S. Basic Income Guarantee Network and the co-editor of Basic Income Studies. I've also co-edited 2 books with Carl Widerquist on Alaska's permanent fund dividend and written many articles on topics related to basic income. Ben Earl is the general manager of both the Basic Income Canada Network and UBI Works. He has more than 15 years of experience in community-based research and development and in nonprofit management. His interest in basic income stems from his time as a graduate student, where he examined the structural violence of poverty in post-industrial communities in Ontario. Chandra Pasma is a policy analyst based in Ottawa. She specializes in issues of income security, poverty, and precarious work. She has worked in politics, for nonprofits, and currently works for one of Canada's largest labor unions. As a longtime advocate for basic income, Chandra frequently writes and speaks on the relationship between basic income and employment. And along with Sheila Reguer, Chandra co-authored the paper, Basic Income, Some Policy Options for Canada, which modeled some ways in which basic income could be implemented in Canada. Chandra is a member of the Basic Income Canada Network Advisory Council. Now, what I'm going to do next is a short presentation to kind of pose the problem, and then I will be acting as moderator and posing questions to our 2 other panelists. So let me share my screen. And I will make this full screen. Let's see. Okay, it's not. There we go. All right. I've titled this, Is Universality Worth Fighting For? I'm going to start with the sort of ideal definition of a basic income that you find in the Basic Income European Network. A basic income is a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means test or work requirement. Now, the term basic income is used in a lot of different ways, but this is the standard definition from Bien. And the central feature we want to focus on today is universality, the notion that this is something that should be paid to everyone, including rich people, without any means test or, as we say, an income test. And many of the other features I think we'll sort of take for granted, but we're going to focus on the question whether it should go to everybody. And I think the basic income movement is kind of at a crossroads, with some people like in the United States, Andrew Yang, wanting to give payments to every resident. And on the other hand, people like Chris Hughes at the Economic Security Project wanting to just target minimum income to people who need it. So at USBIG, we call as an umbrella term a basic income guarantee to include both basic income in this sense that we find from Bien, which is a universal basic income, but also minimum income guarantees, whether they take the form of a negative income tax or an income tested minimum income. Um, an interesting thing that actually won me over to universal basic income was the observation that the net effect on taxpayers is the same. Universal basic income might appear to be more costly, but if you look at select income groups, say someone who earns zero income, another person with $20,000 of earned income, 50,000 or 200,000, if you give them a negative income tax or means tested minimum income to ensure that everybody's income does not fall below $10,000 per year, the person with zero earned income would get $10,000. They would pay no taxes and their net income would be $10,000. Somebody earning $20,000, their cash from a means-tested minimum income would begin to phase out. They would get $6,000 of cash. They would pay $4,000 toward the minimum income scheme if their income is taxed at 20%. But they would have a $4,000 tax credit, so that would effectively cancel out, and their net income would be $20,000 plus the $6,000, bringing their income up to $26,000. Someone earning $50,000, if their income is taxed at 20% to support the scheme, the $10,000 they pay in taxes would be canceled out by a $10,000 credit. They would receive no cash, and they would break even, keeping all of their $50,000 in earned income. Now, someone earning $200,000, taxed at 20%, they would pay $40,000 in income. They would, in effect, receive a $10,000 credit, but they'd get nothing in cash, and their net income would be $170,000. Notice they are net contributors to the scheme. The persons earning $0 and $20,000 are net beneficiaries. The person making $50,000 breaks even. Now, compare that to a universal basic income designed to bring about the same effect. Nobody's income falls below $10,000. You give $10,000 to every one of these groups, including the person making $200,000. That person making $200,000 pays $40 in taxes, $40,000 in taxes, but they have the $10,000 in basic income, so their net income is $170,000. The same as in the minimum income means tested scheme, and similarly with the others. The net income of recipients and taxpayers is the same, whether you do it with a means or income tested minimum income or giving everybody cash. It's really two different ways of achieving the same end. So the question is, what are the advantages of the universal scheme over the income tested scheme? Well, first of all, it's a better way to express the principle of a right of each person to a per capita share of the commonwealth. Everybody should receive that same dividend. If everybody gets a cash payment, that's a very clear expression of that. A second advantage, or at least challenging the claim that there's a disadvantage, as I've just shown, the net effect on taxpayers is the same, whether you adopt a UBI or an MMI. So there's no disadvantage in giving everybody a cash payment versus giving it in a targeted way. And the third point is what's sometimes referred to as the paradox of redistribution, that benefits that go to everybody tend to be more substantial, more robust, more resistant to political challenge. Compare, for example, in the United States, Social Security, which goes to almost everybody, with something like temporary assistance to needy families, which goes only to the poor. This is sometimes thought of as a paradox. If you've got a given pot of money, it would seem to do more benefit to people who need it if you target it. But the untargeted Social Security benefit is actually more robust. It does more to eliminate old age poverty. It's very difficult to challenge politically. Whereas TANF is stingy, it does not reach everybody who needs it. It is constantly under attack. And so you actually can achieve more good by giving a benefit to everybody, because people are then willing to pay the taxes to make it a robust benefit. Fourth advantage is uptake. Somebody mentioned at one of the panels yesterday that the uptake of TANF benefits and food stamps at their best is about 80%, meaning that 20% of the people who need it aren't getting it. Well, if you have a universal benefit, it goes to everybody, and that solves the uptake problem. A fifth advantage is the removal of stigma. And in fact, stigma is one of the reasons that people often don't apply for benefits that are targeted. They don't want to be stigmatized as poor, as undeserving, and so forth. A benefit that goes to everybody has no stigma because everybody receives it. And finally, ease of administration. If you give a benefit to everybody, you do not have to go through the bureaucratic process of determining whether people qualify or not. You're not churning people in and out of benefits. So why then is there often a preference for the means-tested minimum income over a universal benefit? The first is the apparent higher cost of universal basic income. It does have a higher gross cost, but the net cost is the same, as I pointed out. And the second argument has to do with churning. And to illustrate both of these points, what we mean by gross cost is the figure you get at when you simply take, let's say, $12,000 of a minimum income, you multiply by the total population of, let's say, roughly 300 million, and you get a figure of $3.6 trillion. That's the gross cost. You are indeed, the net contributors are dumping 3.6 trillion into the government's dump truck. The government has a bigger budget. It distributes cash to everybody. But notice what happens. Those rich people who have put 3 trillion into the funding scheme for the basic income, 600 billion goes to the net beneficiaries, but 3 trillion goes right back to the net contributors. So they're no worse off for having put that money in the truck because they get it all back. If you compare that with the means-tested minimum income, let's say we're trying to get $12,000 a year to about 50 million people who need it, that's $600 billion. The net contributors put far less into the truck. The same 600 billion goes to the net beneficiaries. They don't get anything back. But they don't need to because they didn't put it in there in the first place. So for the cost that really matters, the cost to the people who pay, there's not a difference between these. It's just a choice of which scheme you want to adopt. So the cost issue is really less of a problem than what's called churning. And churning is simply this dumping large amounts of money into the government coffers and then channeling large amounts of it back again. And I've always failed to see why that is an inherent obstacle, but it does seem to be a serious problem. If you want to see further work on this, I recommend that you look at Carl Widerquist's argument in 2017, a back of the envelope calculation of a basic income. So to conclude, what this leads me to ask is it possible to design a means-tested scheme, or more precisely an income-tested scheme, that nevertheless realizes most of the benefits of universality? And on the other hand, are there compelling reasons to stop fighting for universality and instead push for an income-tested, unconditional, guaranteed minimum income? Now let me stop my screen share and let's see. I'm not getting the icon that, oh, there it is. Okay. Now, the first question I want to put to Chandra and Ben is to clarify, this question really came to me from Chandra. What is the difference between income testing and means testing, and what are the advantages of a basic income that is universal versus income tested? when the net distributional effects are the same. You want to take that first, Chandra?
Thanks, Mike. And let me start by saying it's a real pleasure to be joining everyone today. I'm on the unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe in Ottawa, Canada. And I think that this question of means testing versus income testing is at the heart of the differences of opinion between Canadian basic income advocates and American basic income advocates. I think a lot of it comes down to our familiarity and comfort level with income tested programs in Canada. So the difference between means testing and income testing is really crucial, and you kind of use them interchangeably, Mike, but they're actually pretty different things. So means testing is what we have with social assistance programs in Canada, and that would be what you would have with TANF in the US. So it's not only your income that counts for the program, it's also your assets, how much you have in your bank account, what kind of retirement savings you have, if you have any life insurance policy, how much your house and your car are worth, and if they're worth too much, you might have to sell them and have a lesser home or transportation. There's also a much broader definition of income. So if your parents try to help you out by buying groceries, you have to declare that, and that can reduce the benefits that you get. And you have to prove that your costs are reasonable. So means testing is really comprehensive, really intrusive, and really starts from the supposition that people are trying to game the system, that they're hiding money, that they're not using all the means they have at their disposal to get by without support. And income testing is totally different than that. It just looks at income, not savings or assets. So you could have $50,000 in the bank and declare an income of $5,000, and you would still get access to that income tested benefit. It's also based on the income tax definition of income. So, you know, your parents giving you a $150 check for your birthday doesn't count against the income being tested for the benefit. This is the model that we have in Canada for seniors benefits and children's benefits already. And those are basic income type programs, which is why Canadians are comfortable and familiar with that idea. And I think, I mean, I don't know the US social policy as well, but I see fewer income tested programs and definitely not at the national level. And I think that accounts for some of the difference in comfort level. I don't know if you want me to stop here and let Ben weigh in, or if you want me to talk about the advantages of the different models right away, Mike.
Maybe if Ben wants to address the first question, then we can come back to Chandra.
Yeah, I just want to add very quickly, the whole thing that Chandra's talking about around means testing is this idea of asset stripping. And what it really does is puts people in a significantly disadvantaged position before they can even qualify for income security support programs. So that's why means testing is real challenging. And we see this question, why do people stay on these programs for longer periods of time? Because they have no foundation to grow from, because before they can even qualify, they have to have nothing left. So that's a significant component of the problem of means testing. And that's why an income testing approach can resolve a lot of those issues that we see. And that's why the distinction is very important, especially when we're talking about a basic income program and how it might work.
Yeah. So, Chandra, do you want to then take up the question of the relative advantages of basic income, whether it's universal or income tested?
Yeah, and I think the point Ben made is really important, because means testing really pathologizes people's behavior, whereas income testing starts from the supposition that people's choices don't matter to us. It's only their income level that matters. So a couple of years ago, it actually came out at the beginning of 2020, but it feels like a couple of years ago because of the pandemic. Sheila Regier and I released this paper, which models some options for Canada. And we modeled two income tested approaches, one that covered only working age adults and one that covered all adults 18 plus. And then one that modeled a universal demogrant or universal payments option. So everybody got the same payment amount in that third option. And what we found, this was a really comprehensive model, so it was both the revenue and the basic income side. We were looking not only at how does the disposable income of families and individuals change because of the basic income that they're getting, but also how much are they losing in taxes, how much are they losing in government transfers that are reduced because of this. So it was a very comprehensive analysis. And what we found is that the outcomes of both models, the income tested and universal payment, are very similar. So they both significantly reduced income inequality. They both promote gender equality, and they can both be done in a progressive way that benefits the families in the lower half of the income distribution, while the cost is borne by individuals who are in the higher half of the income distribution. So just to be clear, based on our modeling, these were a couple specific ways of structuring it. It's not the only way you would have to structure an income tested model, or the only way you would have to structure a universal payments model. But from what we saw in the comparison between the three models that we did put together, the benefits of the universal payment approach is definitely on the administration side. There's just a lot less work figuring out who is owed what and how to get that money out the door to them. And I think we've seen that same benefit in the pandemic with emergency response benefits, that when you need to get benefits out the door in a hurry, paying the same amount to everybody and then figuring out the difference later is the fastest way to go. But our modeling also showed that there are some challenges to the universal payment approach. One of them is political, as you raised. So the net costs of our three models were roughly the same, but the gross costs are not. The gross cost of our universal payment model was 3 times the amount of the existing federal budget in Canada. And, I get what you're saying about churning, Mike, but I've also knocked on doors, and I can't imagine trying to sell a voter on the doorstep on the idea that we're going to introduce a single program that's worth 3 times the existing government budget. And there's also the challenge of the tax rate. So it's true that when you combine the reduction rate of the income tested model with the income tax structure, then your marginal tax rate is roughly equivalent to the tax rate that we had to set to claw back the payment in the universal approach. But, one is hidden and people don't understand how much it is. And in the other, we had to set the tax rate at 75%. And I can tell you, having had many voters on the doorstep panic at the idea that we might even raise their taxes 1 or 2%, that I would not want to be the politician going out to tell people I was going to raise their taxes 75%, even if they were going to come out ahead at the end of all of that. And then I think the thing that surprised Sheila and I the most was that there's actually a challenge in fairness for single individuals, which isn't necessarily a function of income tested versus universal payments, because to be fair, we had made the income tested model based on family composition and the universal payments model was not. But it meant that there was this significant gap between 2-person households and single person households in our universal payments model that did not exist in the income tested model. And so, there was a significant fairness and equality issue there that I think would need to be addressed if you were going to go with the universal demogrant model.
Do you want to add anything on that, Ben?
The only thing I will add at this point is the question of relative advantage, and this question of universality to me, and I think this will come up maybe more in other questions, really comes down to one of what you're trying to do with the program and the intent of it, and also how it's resourced and funded. Yes, everything is true what Chandra has said, and I completely support that argument in the Canadian context. If we design a program that is funded and develop it the same way as other types of programs and developed. But I also know that internationally and there's other ways of looking at the intent of the program. And that's where the question of universality really, and the relative advantages or disadvantages of programs really will come to play, because we're not comparing the same thing when we're talking about these types of programs. They're not always exactly the same thing, at least in the Canadian context, they're not. And I think that's where we really need to couch our discussion of relative advantage. Yes, a program designed the way that would work politically and practically in Canada is a more practical and is relatively better if it's a GMI or a negative income tax model. But that may not be true for all jurisdictions. And I think that's really got to be part of what's understood in this discussion of universality.
The next question I wanted to pose is, can a program be conceived of as universal without everyone receiving the same thing? In other words, universal eligibility rather than universal payments. And why have Canadian basic income advocates promoted income-tested forms of basic income? You've partly addressed that second part, but you might want to say a bit more, Chandra.
Yeah, I think that's really the crux of it. And you know, I agree with Ben 100% that what model is appropriate depends on your political, social, and economic context. And even for Canada, the universal demogrant or payments model was appropriate for us during the pandemic, but I'm not sure that it's appropriate for us in non-emergency times. I don't think that it would be achievable in non-emergency times. But I think that the political, social, and economic context of the US is really different. And I think, you know, we're starting to tease out some of those differences, and that's why it may not be appropriate there. And, you know, the same would go for any other country. There are some countries where income-tested models might absolutely be the way to go, and then others where the universal model is the right approach, and that can change over time as circumstances change. But one reason why I think we are so much more comfortable is because we do have universal programs in Canada where it is the eligibility that is universal, and it is not the outcome or the transfer to individuals that is universal. So obviously healthcare is the biggest difference. You know, we have a universal healthcare system in Canada. And so we are very familiar with the idea that the eligibility of every individual is the same. But it doesn't mean that we all get the same amount of healthcare every year. It means that you get the healthcare when you need it. And the only question is, do you need it? And our children's benefits are structured in the same way. So all kids are eligible for the program. There's no kind of condition as to whether or not children are going to qualify for this. But rather than the government writing higher income parents a check, and then those parents writing a check back to the government to pay back the amount in taxes that they don't need, there's just one check. But as soon as your income drops, and you know, during the period that I've had children, my income has been up and down, and so sometimes my benefit increases and sometimes my benefit decreases, and the only thing that has changed is my income level. So I think that has been a large reason why Canadians are more comfortable. I think we also have a higher degree of social solidarity in Canada without quite approaching Nordic levels of social solidarity. So I think there's less fear or less risk that benefits will be cut or driven down if they're income tested. I also think that we've also addressed the uptake problem with our income tested programs. So, you know, we did have a problem with our seniors benefits for a while, that there was an uptake problem, but then they introduced automatic enrollment. So all you do is file your taxes and the government automatically enrolls you when you reach 65. And the same thing has been done with children's benefits. So you eliminate this uptake problem because nobody's applying for anything. The government just determines whether or not you qualify based on what your income is.
Did you want to add anything, Ben?
The only thing I'll add is one of the other reasons the uptake is not a problem is outside of the automatic part of it, if you just have to file taxes, we have active programs at the municipal level in Canada where they work to enroll low-income families and individuals into to file their taxes. It's an financial empowerment initiative that is meant to recoup resources that are available to Canadians, and this exists at the municipal level across the country. So we've actively invested in making sure uptake is automatic and achieved for everyone as well.
Yeah, and this partly addresses the next question I had, which is how can income-tested forms of basic income be designed to most closely approximate the advantages of universal schemes? Were there any other aspects of the advantages of a universal program that you think could be reached in addition to uptake? There's you know, the paradox of redistribution. Are there other aspects of universal programs that you think can be as well achieved in an income-tested program?
Well, I think our higher levels of social solidarity in some ways address the redistribution problem because there's not like there's definitely stigma around social assistance, and people do not want to be receiving social assistance if they can help it. But there's no stigma at all around OAS, GIS, or children's benefits. And I think the fact that the benefits do extend well into the middle class provides some of that social solidarity. They might be getting very small amounts, but it's still seen as an entitlement. And let me tell you, you do not want to be the politician who introduces a proposal to touch old age security, because it makes seniors really mad. And all the politicians who have tried to do so in recent years have backed away really fast. But what I would say, the paper that Sheila and I did suggests that there's ways you can structure both benefits that achieve similar outcomes. But for both types, the questions that matter more is not actually who's, is the payment universal or is it not? It's the questions about what is the benefit amount and how are you structuring the benefit based on family composition and how are you paying for it? Because that's what's determining whether or not the outcomes are progressive or not. So it's really important that you really think carefully and do some of this modeling to ask what are the different outcomes for different groups, and then tweak as needed. We needed to do quite a bit of tweaking to arrive at a progressive end for all of our benefit formats. But I will say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good either, because I was definitely not a fan of the Ontario Basic Income Pilot when they announced it. And how they deliberately set the benefit well below the poverty level. And yet we saw that it was enormously transformative for the lives of the participants. Like the monetary value of the benefit is important, but so are the non-monetary aspects of it. These intangibles are so important for people's lives. And so I think taking steps towards what we want and not insisting on the perfect utopia is very important.
Mm-hmm. And Ben?
No, I'll leave it at that. Chandra covered.
Okay.
Covered what I would say.
So the last question before we turn to the audience is, do you think that basic income advocates should continue to push for universality of payments or let go of that?
I could start, and this goes a bit to the earlier point I was making. And this might not be, I kind of sit on the gray area on this one. It depends on what you're fighting for, right? It really, what you're trying to achieve with a basic income really matters when the question of universality comes into play. If you are trying to, in the Canadian context, if we're trying to address poverty and income inequality at the most extreme levels, then universality in the most strict definition doesn't necessarily make sense. There's evidence that it's less efficient, and there's better ways to achieve it, and that is through, in one example, through a negative income tax or a guaranteed minimum income model. So if you're fighting for that, then yeah, maybe you should, depending on your context, stop and not worry so much about it. But if you're thinking about larger issues, if you're thinking about the social commons, for example, if you're thinking about common ownership, the similar arguments that Andrew Yang were making around the technological commons and the natural commons, if you're thinking about those and you're thinking about a universal basic income as a social dividend, as a right of residency and citizenship, then yeah, universality really matters because that's what that type of program is about. So it really, you have to choose what you're fighting for. And I will say, although most Canadian advocates at this point are on line with the GMI, the group I work with, UBI Works, does support a guaranteed minimum income as the most immediate first step towards achieving poverty reduction and addressing the immediate concerns of inequality. But they are actively, and we are actively working towards how a future dividend could look in Canada that is based off our social commons and our shared commonwealth. So there are, in Canadian context, there are groups that are thinking future and thinking about other types of models with different goals in mind, right? There's different goals to the program. So that's where universality matters, is what you're trying to achieve. I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Chandra, did you want to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, I agree with Ben. And I would also say that the context in which you're advocating really, really matters. There are some contexts in which an income tested one is more achievable, more likely, and I think is the better goal. And there are some contexts in which the universal payments approach is more achievable, more likely, and the more realistic goal. And as the pandemic showed that, which is the more realistic and achievable goal can change over time. So I think I think we need to show some flexibility and focus on the ultimate goal of transforming people's lives and not what is ideologically or philosophically perfect, because even smaller steps towards basic income can be deeply transformative.
All right, let's take some questions from the audience. We got the first question is, as Michael hinted, UBI is about ownership of common property, the commons. So how do we sell this and forget about all the comparisons to social income programs? To me, this is the core issue. Here is building a movement around ownership of co-created wealth, which is completely irrelevant and a distraction to the important and urgent intentions of the guaranteed basic income movement, which is about poverty and labor market transition. That question is from Floyd. So either one of you want to respond?
Do you want me to, Chandra?
Yeah, go for it, Ben.
Thanks, Floyd. Yeah, I know, I agree. The movement that we have to build, this goes to my previous point. We need to be very clear what we're talking about and fighting for. And there is, in my mind and in many other advocates' mind, there is a need to both address the immediate concerns that a guaranteed minimum income can do, but there's a larger need to think about where we're going in the 21st century and the economy and the workforce that we have. And building an argument in Canada about common ownership is hugely important. Our common access to, or our common right to land and resources that come out of it, our common right to technology and the assets that we've created collectively. We know that a lot of the benefit of that are currently concentrated to a handful of corporations or individuals. There is, and we can see that in the great, the growing divide between productivity growth and wages in many jurisdictions, including Canada, the U.S. We're not capturing the wealth we create together through jobs in the traditional way. So this, if we're going to build those types of arguments, we need to really get to Canadians or Americans or wherever we are and really speak to them about how these shifts have impacted them and what it means for them on the ground and what it means for them to be working harder than their parents were or their grandparents were, but bringing home and bringing home less and creating less wealth for themselves and their families. So I think that's the grounds that we need to build that second argument around the commons on. But that is distinct from a social justice and a poverty reduction argument, and both are complementary and both are important. But we do need to make sure we're very clear in that distinction.
Yeah, can I just add something in response to that? Because I completely agree with Ben that we're just not there in Canada. Like, the likelihood that we would get some universal model and recognition of co-ownership of the commons is not going to happen anytime soon. And the idea that we would let people continue to live on social assistance, which is horrible, demeaning, and leaves people living far below the poverty line, while we fight for something that I don't think is realistic or achievable on a near term time frame, to me that would be unacceptable. Like, let's implement a basic income that's income tested, that gets people out of poverty, and then continue to fight to make that universal if we consider that to be an important goal. But let's not leave people living in poverty, losing access to their children, going hungry every day right now.
All right, we have a second question from Leah Werner. What potential benefits do you see in funding a basic income through other means than income tax? Either one of you want to take that up?
Well, I can speak a bit to that. We are starting to, UBI Works is actually starting to explore that type of model. What are some other ways that we could fund a social commons or a social dividend based on our commons? So there is active work in the Canadian context starting to look at things like land value, other types of economic rents, resource rents, electromagnetic spectrum rents, different types of models that exist in other jurisdictions or that others have done research on that we could apply to our to the Canadian context. So there is an interest in looking at what are those other things, and that's actually part of the distinction. When we do our modeling, yes, it doesn't always look right to model a universal dividend next to a a guaranteed minimum income, because they should be funded differently, right? So yes, of course, one is going to cost huge amounts of money if we fund it based off the current tax base and the current income tax system. It's going to be distorted because it shouldn't actually be, in my opinion, shouldn't be designed that way. It should be designed to be resourced in different ways. So we do need to really explore what those other options might be and really lean into some of the work that's been done on economic rents and other types of taxation or revenue generation tools that we don't really consider. And that's part of the advocacy that we need to start doing to get us to the point where it is on the table, where that type of thing could be a reality for Canada or the United States. We need to really make sure that it's understood.
And I think that's part of the challenge right now, that it's really conducting two debates, because, over the past 40 years, we've also had this real attack on our tax system and elimination of other forms of taxation except personal income taxes. And so there's a familiarity and a comfort level with personal income taxes that doesn't exist with other forms of taxation. And I think the pandemic has started to change that a little. Like, there's now a conversation in Canada about a wealth tax. We don't have one yet, but 10 years ago, that conversation would have been unthinkable. We're seeing with the G7 a conversation about financial transfer taxes, which, is another potential massive source of revenue. And yet it's not one that most countries like Canada and the US have been comfortable with until now. And so I think it's really a two-pronged debate, right? It's both the basic income side, but you also have to create the public support and comfort level for other forms of revenue beyond income taxes.
Sorry, can I just add one thing?
Sure.
One of the benefits of these other types of discussions, to Chandra's point, is that the other part of the debate is they can also look at solving other types of problems. It's not just about creating revenue for a basic income. And a good example of that is a carbon tax or a carbon payment, right? You may not apply it necessarily to a basic income, but that type of example, you're solving multiple problems. You're generating revenue while also addressing other problems, in this case, carbon emissions, right? Right? And we could debate all day their effectiveness, but that's the point behind that program, is to address multiple problems, generate revenue, which could be redirected in any way a government chooses or that the voters support, but also address the underlying problem that you're taxing or that you're generating revenue from. And that's the two-pronged debate, is we should be looking at, if we're going to look at that type of dividend, we should also be thinking about the other types of problems that could be solved from the tools that we're using.
All right, our next question is from Sid Frankel. Are differences in gross cost not significant in terms of political feasibility? Chandra partly answered that, I think, in her remarks earlier, but did you want to add anything to that?
Hugely so. I mean, I'm sure Ben has had a similar experience in talking to politicians, but even the cost of an income-tested model makes some politicians hesitate. Like, the gross cost is definitely a huge stumbling block, and that's to politicians across the spectrum. That's not just right-wing politicians. Even left-wing politicians don't want to be advocating for a program that has costs in the hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah, we've had lots of questions in our own work and advocacy work at BICN and even at UBI Works and others about, well, isn't there other ways you could spend those resources? Could you not invest in universal services or other types of programming? So we're definitely hearing the questioning of the cost and how is it the best way to use the resources. So it's absolutely a stumbling block, but I think one that's surmountable. We need to make sure our arguments and our discussion and our evidence is sound.
Okay, and we have a question from Max Guinness. How did the marginal tax rates on the poor differ between the income tested and universal models? I think that's a question for Chandra.
Yeah, so I'm trying to remember what the basic, because we got rid of the basic personal amount. So I think the first tax threshold was 17. And plus you have your 40% reduction rate. So for the first income bracket, then the tax rate is, doing the math in my head, 57%, and it goes up with every tax bracket. So certainly you quickly reach the point where the marginal tax rate of the income tested model mirrors what we had to set the tax rate for the universal payments model. And, you know, just to make a little plug, I think the link went in for the paper. You can check it out online because there's more information on what the tax rates were and how we went about it, and all kinds of tables and charts on what the outcomes were. So I think the argument is not the universal payments model has a high tax rate and the other doesn't. It's the fact that people can see it, that it's upfront. That's a big challenge for people who, you know, politicians who want to sell this program.
We are actually beginning to go over time, so although there are many questions remaining, we're going to need to call this session to a close. It's generated multiple questions, and we don't have to stop the conversation here. We have Kumo space. I encourage everybody to go over there. I hope our speakers can migrate over there as well, and continue the conversation in a more informal way. We will be finishing up later this afternoon. Of particular note, I would encourage you to take a look at the 2 p.m. keynote on Champions of Basic Income, which will be primarily Canadian politicians who have signed on to basic income. And at 4 p.m., Basic Income in the Arts, and the concluding keynote, Reflections on the Movement and Next Steps. And I think the links of those have been put in the chat or will be momentarily. If not, you can find them in the schedule in Crowdcast. So I want to thank Chandra and Ben and everybody in the audience. We had a very lively chat going here, and I look forward to seeing you in Kumo Space and some other sessions later today. Bye-bye.